New year, same problems for the Seattle Seahawks against the San Francisco 49ers as they drop their sixth consecutive matchup against their NFC West foes. What went wrong on Thursday Night Football? We'll be breaking it all down in our latest post-game edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined here on our post-game show by my co-host, Connor Benintendi, and a special thanks to all the 12s who are listening in, whether you're nearby West Seattle or if you're down in Australia. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you. All right, Seahawks falling to 3-3. We saw the red-hot 3-0 start, and now we've seen the opposite here, losing 3 consecutive games. And, Connor, this is going to be one that's going to sting for a while. And I guess the only good news here is the Seahawks have a little bit more time for this to marinate with a mini bye, so to speak. But a 36-24 loss to the 49ers, and this was a really weird game. At one point, the Seahawks were down 23-20. Then they got within 6 points. They had the ball in their hands with a chance to go tie or take the lead. They couldn't quite get over that hump. And then late, they allowed a couple big plays, and it ended up being a 12-point loss, a game that honestly felt like it was getting away early, but there were so many missed opportunities. This is going to be one that's going to sting for a while.
Yeah, and they're glad to be done with the 3 games in 11 days thing, Corbin. I can guarantee you that. It's so hard to categorize these 3 different losses. They all feel somewhat different in a different way, Corbin. It's like you have the Lions game, which is, an encouraging loss to some degree when you're down all the starters that Seattle is down, but the offense looks good. Things are looking up. Then you have so many questions after last week's loss, particularly with the offense, which is the opposite of the previous week, with Ryan Grubb being so adverse to running the football, all these different things that come out of that, storylines, everything else. And then this game, you just really don't have any one particular unit that stood out in this game. I mean, you really had pretty much domination throughout most of the game for San Francisco. And really the only thing that sparked Seattle back into this game was Laviska Shenault's 97-yard kickoff return touchdown, which is a great play, but he also had a fumble on a return earlier in the game. And we're going to get to it, but it's the self-inflicted wounds. I mean, Seattle has lost the turnover battle 6-1 over their last 3 games. That's just a formula to lose football games right there. You don't win football games that way. And there's not one thing that I can pick out and say Seattle did this great today. There's not one single thing. Geno Smith had his worst game of the season by far. Again, we're going to go over it, but you know me, Corbin, I'm a huge Geno supporter. This was one of the worst games I've seen Geno play in I don't know how long. He looked horrible. He overthrew that first pass to Tyler Lockett that resulted in an interception on Seattle's first drive of the game, and that really set the tone for the entire game. Second interception, it was a lazy route by DK, but at the end of the day, Geno still threw it, still picked. It's not one of the other fluky ones that he had earlier in the season, wherever he had batted passes and things like that. At the end of the day, he still threw the ball. It still resulted in an interception in a key spot. There's just so little positive things that I can take away from this.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that a game that was within 6 points for a good chunk of the second half, that it's so hard to find positives other than, look, we have seen this from this team the last 3 weeks. If there's one positive thing I can say, they don't give up. They do continue to battle, and we've seen them do that. We saw them will themselves back into the game last week against the Giants. We saw it in Detroit that they kept coming back, getting within 1 score. But the problem is, Connor, they keep putting themselves in this spot because they're getting off to horrible starts on both sides of the football. And look, I asked Mike Macdonald about it tonight. His defense went out and gave up 2 long drives to open both halves. They did that on defense against the Giants this past game as well. This is becoming an ugly trend that they have got to get figured out. And Mike Macdonald said, well, I don't think we've been flat. Look, I'm just going to tell you right now, you have been flat. They have been flat coming out of games. They've been flat on offense. They've been flat on defense. And Ryan Grubb went too far in the other direction early in this game. Like, he decided, you know what, I'm going to run 75% of the time. Look, I think that it was the right mindset because you can't drop back to throw as much as they ended up throwing this game. And credit to the offensive line. We'll talk more about this later. Geno Smith wasn't sacked until late in this game. So there's another positive that we can glean from this, but it's so hard to look at this game and all the different things that went wrong and be positive at all coming out of this. I mean, you gave up 228 rushing yards. A lot of that came on 3 carries in this game, including the 76-yarder at the end of the game that was by the third string running back for the 49ers. And I believe it's Isaac Guarendo, or Guarendo, however you pronounce his name.
Guarendo, I think it is. Yeah.
Guarendo. He has played so little that I don't even remember how to pronounce his name. I do remember him from Louisville, but 76-yard run on first down. You knew the 49ers were running the ball, and it did not matter. We just continue to see these explosive plays. You had Julian Love, that nightmarish coverage against Deebo Samuel, where he ended up not noticing it was underthrown. It affected his route. He misses a tackle, and then Samuel's gone. 76-yard touchdown on that. So they continue to give up these big plays. They didn't get any sacks on Brock Purdy. I think that is a big underlying story here, that they just continue to not be able to get pressure on Brock Purdy when he drops back to pass. And then on offense, the 2 turnovers that Geno Smith had, you had Laviska Shenault's turnover in special teams. All 3 units were culprits for this loss. And like you said, in the last 2 games, you could at least look at one phase of the game and say, well, I think they played pretty well. On offense against Detroit, the defense had their moments in the second half against the Giants where they kept Seattle in the game. But this game, it was really hard to look at any of those phases of the game and feel like, well, here is a positional group, or here's a unit that we can feel really good about. All 3 phases. I guess if you're looking for a positive from it, hey, we got to improve everywhere. Let's just attack everything. But that's not what you want to see coming out of a game like this. You're hoping that you made some progress in some way, shape, or form. You gave up all those rushing yards, all those explosives. You couldn't run the ball, even though you tried more in this game. And then Geno Smith, who's been your best constant, he has a rough game. Seahawks fans got to see that. It was really difficult to watch this game. And it's amazing that they were able to make it a competitive one that got interesting down the stretch.
Yeah, and one thing, Corbin, that I've been maybe a little bit disappointed in over these past couple games is I would have liked to see – we saw this from Ryan Grubb, okay, during the week, where Ryan Grubb took a whole lot of flack for his game plan going into the Giants game, rightfully so. He did not run the ball. He should have ran the ball. He said, I'll own that. He basically said it was malpractice the way that he game planned that game. One thing I have not seen from Mike Macdonald is some level of responsibility for the way that this defense is playing. And I think that that's something that we cannot just overlook at this point, because I understand that there are injuries. There are a ton of injuries that are stacking up. It's constant. It's different players. It's the same players through and through over the last 3 games. But these numbers are getting ridiculous. At this point, you've allowed, over the last 3 games, Seattle has allowed an average of 173 yards on the ground. At the same time, quarterbacks are completing 73.8% of their passes for 804 yards to 7 touchdowns and 0 interceptions. That is abysmal defense. And Mike Macdonald was hired to be a defensive mastermind that's going to come in and turn this defense around. That's not to say he will not do that. But I would have liked to see when do we start to blame the coaching, especially because Mike Macdonald is saying that these guys are playing their hearts out. They're fighting to the end, everything else. The effort is there. The effort is there. The effort is there. I love all that. But then what's falling short for this team right now? What is going wrong to where all of these players are in the wrong position at the wrong time? Why are we giving up these big plays constantly to Deebo Samuel in the run game, to Isaac Guarendo? It just doesn't add up to me. I think at some point Mike Macdonald has to look himself in the mirror. He probably already is. Maybe he's just not saying it publicly. But Mike Macdonald has to at some point look himself in the mirror and figure that out.
He, in his defense tonight, there were several times that he was saying, look, we've got to do a better job. But the point is, though, when you look at the execution, that continues to be what players are saying. Execution boils down to how the coaches have gotten you prepared. And I'm going to keep bringing this up. Look, he can say whatever he wants, but your defense is flat coming out of games. They are flat. They are giving up all these long drives. They struggle on early downs, so then it's easier to convert on third down. These are the things that have got to get fixed, and I don't know what it's going to take, but they got to find a way to, and maybe they're too juiced up, but that's not what I'm seeing on the field. I see a team that is really tight, and they're not playing an energized football, and they're flat. So they got to figure this out before Atlanta. And I'll tell you what, that's another team. If your defense is not ready to play, the Atlanta Falcons will put up a lot of points when we get to week 7. Coming up next, look, it's a defeat for the Seahawks, 3 in a row, but we still got to give out game balls. There were some shining stars, albeit not very many of them, in a difficult loss at Lumen Field. We'll get to those coming up next here on our post-game edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by our friends over at PrizePicks. PrizePicks is America's #1 daily fantasy sports app with over 5 million active members. PrizePicks is the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. And unlike other apps on PrizePicks, it's just you against the numbers. PrizePicks is the only real money daily fantasy platform with an injury insurance policy so your lineups stay in play, even if one of your players gets injured. If your player leaves in the first half and doesn't return, PrizePicks keep your lineup live. PrizePicks is the best place to get real money sports action. Join over 10 million users and sign up today. You can win up to 100 times your money on PrizePicks with as little as 4 correct picks. Download the PrizePicks app today and use the code LOCKEDINNFL and get $50 instantly when you play $5. That's the code LOCKEDINNFL on PrizePicks to get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It's guaranteed. PrizePicks, run your game. Welcome back to the post-game edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined here by Connor Benintendi, my co-host here. Thursday night football, unfortunately, did not go the way that the Seahawks were hoping it was going to. They were wanting to get that 4th win, snap a 2-game losing streak, snap a 5-game losing streak to the 49ers themselves, and it was more of the same. And Connor, it feels like there's been so many trends in the last couple of years against the 49ers. The special teams turnovers, it seems like that's happening every time these teams get together. And then you've got the passing breakdowns that lead to either sacks or turnovers, and then the big plays for the 49ers, the same recipe every single time. Nonetheless, there were a few players that had solid games tonight at Lumen Field. So let's get to our weekly game balls. On the offensive side of the football, there were a couple of pass catchers that stood out in this game, at least had decent contests against the 49ers. Who stood out to you, good sir? You're muted.
Sorry about that one. I took Noah Fant in this one just because when it comes down to it, look, the tight ends have not been a huge factor in terms of the passing game so far this season, but Fant, just towards the end of the game there, he started to factor in the short passing game, and he has been that so far for Seattle. So in an area where there were a few bright spots, I thought Fant had a pretty darn good game overall, and I would give him a game ball here just because there are a few bright spots on that offensive side of the ball, and I thought he did a pretty darn good job tonight.
I think he picked up 3 first downs with those 6 catches too. So he was consistently moving the chains. I'm going to go to the old standby that is Tyler Lockett. And I thought he had the most complete game of any player on the Seahawks on offense. Obviously, he scored that late touchdown, the 9-yarder on 4th and goal from Geno Smith. He had a 37-yard catch. So we finally got to see an explosive. There haven't been as many of those for Tyler Lockett the last year and a half. A guy that early in his career, he was regularly a deep ball threat. At this stage of his career, he doesn't do that quite as much, but we got to see that 37-yarder that Geno Smith dropped in the bucket. I thought Geno played a little bit better after that throw, and it kind of got him back in a rhythm, but Tyler Lockett was one of the few guys on the offensive side of the football that jumped out to me and said, you know what? He really didn't make any mistakes. There was a play in the end zone that I thought he could have made, but that was a couple plays before the touchdown. So he got his redemption. Nonetheless, I feel like Tyler Lockett had the most complete game of anybody on offense. That's maybe not saying a lot, but this was still a steady game. 4 catches, 65 yards, and a touchdown. On the defensive side of the football, I actually had a harder time with this because you give up 228 passing yards, all the big plays in the passing game. I mean, Brock Purdy had 255 passing yards on just 18 completions today. That makes it really difficult to single out a defensive player That being said, we have to give a defensive game ball, and there were a few guys that at least made some splashy plays for the Seahawks on that side of the ball.
Yeah, Jerome Baker in a overall bad showing for the linebackers, as we're probably going to get to, Corbin. I thought Jerome Baker just had a couple good individual plays today, and I know that he hasn't been exceptional in his return. Tyrell Dodson has been a bigger weak point, though, than Baker, in my opinion. I think he's been pretty solid in his return from injury. He had one play where he just blew up a screen. I can't remember if it was the second or third quarter, but that was like the first play where I was like, wow, okay, look, the defense finally got something going here. Baker was really the only one who sniffed that play out. And that stood out to me in an area where there was very few individual plays that were a wow. And I know on your side too, Corbin, the player that you picked was probably the second and only other play where I was like, that was a great individual play by a defensive player.
Yeah, I was bummed when Artie Burns left the game in the second half, re-injuring his toe, because I thought he played a really good game. He had a pass breakup in the end zone, and I will admit, when I originally saw the play happening live from the press box, it looked like to me it was clear defensive pass interference on him. But when the replay came up, he did as good of a job there of not interfering with the player while still having sticky coverage, and he swatted the ball away from Deebo Samuel. It was outstanding coverage that he had there. He added a second pass breakup later in the first half as well. So I thought Artie Burns, when you consider the circumstances that Seattle, I mean, there was a while Seattle had, they were down Artie Burns, they were down Trey Brown, and we know Reek Woolen didn't play in this game either. It was getting to the point where I was wondering if one of the coaches was going to have to suit up. Maybe Leslie Frazier is going to have to play some corner for the Seattle Seahawks at some point. I mean, they are beyond banged up over there. And losing Burns, that was a big loss. I will give Nehemiah Pritchett some credit, though. He made a couple nice plays after checking in for the second straight week. But Artie Burns was one of the few guys that I felt like really had a solid game before he exited with that injury with the two pass breakups. Only one tackle, but he did a really nice job in coverage and didn't give up a touchdown either. Special teams, this one's a slam dunk. Not that he had a perfect game. We know Laviska Shenault had a fumble in this contest, Connor, that led to 3 points for the 49ers on a kick return. But you want to talk about the ultimate redemption story. The second kick return of this new rule system, returned for a touchdown this year, was by Laviska Shenault, and that's really what jump-started this team early in the second half. The 49ers had just scored, made it 23-3, and then Shenault, 97 yards, rumbles for the touchdown. He broke a couple tackles. He made a guy miss with the juke, and then he was off to the races, and it's 6 points. So this one is a slam dunk. Is the only guy in special teams that really stood out that absolutely deserves a game ball.
We've been looking for somebody to give like a solid, and you know what? I can't even say solid special teams game ball, because of course, there had to be some sort of, drawback to it. Of course, the fact that he had the fumble, but look, the kick return touchdown, I'll give it to him, and especially in the fact that it really seemed to galvanize the team, get him back in the game, cut what was at the time a big deficit a little bit smaller, and was able to get the offense back in the game. So look, Laviska Shenault, I wonder if there was an emphasis more on getting the ball in his hands on returns, because especially on kick returns, I feel like we saw it more in his hands than we did D. Williams, more so in this game than throughout the season. So that may have just been the way that the ball was being kicked. Totally could be, but there also may have been an emphasis on getting it in his hands. And that was just a solid return, Corbin. Bounced off a couple defenders, navigated through all that traffic, and was able to break free. And he ended up having the speed to outrun those defenders. So kudos to Shenault on finally making really his first big play as a Seattle Seahawk.
I do want to give, it's not an honorable mention because it was just one play, but this is what happens when you lose and there are not a lot of great plays. Jake Bobo had an awesome tackle on punt coverage tonight that he just absolutely blew up and demolished the punt returner. So let's give Jake Bobo a little bit of love, because everybody knows he's a receiver, but he's making plays on special teams. So give Jake Bobo some love there. All right, let's transition now into 3 up, 3 down. Even in defeat, you've got to find some players that had solid games. And so we're going to start on the positive side of things in this 36-24 loss to the 49ers. As far as positives go on the offensive side of the football, I can't believe that we're saying this, in part because Nick Bosa had, I believe, 14 pressures in this game, according to NFL Next Gen stats. And yet, I thought the offensive line actually played fairly well in this game, considering circumstances, at least in pass protection.
Yeah, the offensive line just passed the eye test a little bit better today than it has. Like, of course, we're going to have to see the numbers whenever it comes down to it. Right now, they're San Francisco had at least 5 QB hits. We'll see what PFF picks up and what the pressures are and everything else whenever those numbers are finalized and whenever we can watch the film and look at everything else. But overall, that's why it was so shocking that Geno struggled so much today, because we've seen Geno have such good games behind such a shaky offensive line. And really, he's just had literally no time. He has, really the one of the better pressure to sack ratios in the entire NFL, and just the way that he's been able to maneuver that pocket. Today, he was kept pretty darn clean, and overall, Geno just didn't have a good game. So props to the offensive line. The run game didn't really get going. Still not a lot of push up front and able to free Ken Walker. You saw Ken Walker bouncing a lot of runs outside just because there wasn't much of a hole where he was supposed to be going. But overall, and at least in pass protection, the offensive line certainly had a better performance.
It was a stepping stone, and I'm not going to sit here and say that they played great, because that would be an exaggeration. But compared to what we've seen, I guess with expectations, they outperformed expectations for me in pass protection. Going to the defensive side of the football, the 49ers ran for 228 yards. But I felt like overall the defensive line was not the big problem, particularly the interior guys. And Jonathan Hankins had a tackle for loss. There were several times early in the game where Jordan Mason ran into a brick wall. And guess who the brick wall was? It was number 97. I thought Hankins played really well in this game. And I want to give a shout out to Leonard Williams, too. Leonard Williams was the only guy in the Seahawks that had multiple quarterback hits in this game. He got to 2 of them. Unfortunately, wasn't able to get a sack, but we got to see him stand out on some run plays, too. He continues to play well against the 49ers. The defensive line as a whole, the interior guys, I thought played pretty well for most of this game. There were a lot of stuffed runs. Like McDonald was lamenting after the game, like, we can't get that mid-ground. Like, we're either stopping it in the line of scrimmage or we're giving up an explosive run play. I'm not blaming the defensive linemen in that, at least these two. I thought Jonathan Hankins and Leonard Williams both played really good games today.
Yeah, and I think that's so crucial, Corbin, whenever it comes down to trying to figure out what's really wrong with this defense and what are the major deficiencies that are happening. I think it's what McDonald said in particular of there's no middle ground is really telling about what's happening here, because you do have those certain plays where players are just getting out of their gaps. They're either getting pushed out of their gaps or they're trying to make a play in a gap that isn't theirs. And at that point, that makes it so that you have a third string running back who can just hit a hole that is large enough for a truck to drive through it. And next thing you know, he's 50 yards downfield. So Otherwise, though, like you said, Corbin, there was some really, really solid plays in run defense today. And I don't think we saw nearly as much of a pass rush, particularly from some of the guys that we expect that from in Boye Mafe and Derek Hall. But at the end of the day, I think that there was some strides taken, at least stopping the run game in that short to medium range, but you still got to get it to where that becomes consistent over a long period of time.
Yeah, they've got to find a way to eliminate those long runs that continue to hurt them week in, week out. Let's go to the 3 down. We have to. Look, you lost by 12 points. The Seahawks have lost 3 straight games. There's a lot of negatives coming out of this game, unfortunately. We got to start with the battery connection of Geno Smith and DK Metcalf. This was easily Geno Smith's worst game. And this is what I wrote in my article today on Seahawks on SI coming out of the game, my rapid reaction, that the big issue that the Seahawks are going to have to deal with now coming out of this game, from Geno Smith's perspective, you want the national audience to notice you as a top 10 quarterback. And he had been playing like a top 10 QB in the first 5 games by most metrics. And he passed the eye test. He looked very much like a top 10 quarterback, maybe even top 5 for large portions of those first 5 games. You go out and you lay an egg. The first interception was an ugly one. Overthrowing Tyler Lockett. Probably should have thrown that ball. It was not really open. If he would have had a perfect throw, he might have been able to dump it in there. But there were 2 defenders right in the vicinity. Malik Mustafa ends up picking him off. And then there was a 3rd down and 3 that he airmailed Jackson Smith and Jigba on an out route. Like, he does not miss those throws. And for whatever reason today, I don't know if it was the 49ers defensive line and he had the jitters or whatever it was, but this is an example of him not being able to slay the demon, which in this case is the 49ers. He has not been able to figure that out. And if you want the national media, the national narrative to change, you have to perform at a high level and elevate your team to win games like this. And unfortunately, we didn't get to see that. With that being said, I'm not going to listen. I'm just saying this from a football analyst perspective. I do not think that second interception was his fault at all. You could read the body language. You could see the way that the route unfolded for DK Metcalf. Geno Smith was expecting a much tighter dig route there, and it was just kind of a lazy, I'm going to call it a lazy river route, just kind of fading back, and that allowed the defender to cut in front and get that interception that looked so bad. And obviously he's the one that threw it, but it looks to me like when you saw the communications the receiver coach was having with Metcalf afterwards, I don't care what Geno said after the game. I am 100% sure that was on the receiver in that case.
Yeah, look, there's not going to be many people that agree with us, Corbin, but I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, you go back and you watch that replay. I mean, I don't think that Geno should have thrown it in the first place, but when you go and look at it, just watch DK on that route. He makes the in cut and then he just slows down. He completely slows down right as Geno's beginning to throw it, and he allows the DB to cut in front of it. That's not what you expect from your top wide receiver. You do not expect your top wide receiver to stop on a route whenever you're expecting him to continue running into the middle of the field, like right as you're throwing it. I think that this is one of the biggest issues that Seattle has right now, where you have your stars just underperforming. And Geno and DK, particularly in this game, were the ones that really stood out. DK has been, over the last few weeks now, particularly with the fumbles, that's been an issue. All right. If DK wants to be paid like a top 5 wide receiver, which maybe that's what he commands in these next couple seasons, but on his next contract, you have to be able to shore up the ball security issues. You have to shore up the effort issues. You have to not be hopping on the headset and yelling at your offensive coordinator after 2 offensive drives. Like, these are the things that make these trade rumors with DK start to swirl, because he always looks upset about something, right? And it's early in the game. The game's not out of reach whatsoever. You've got a lot of time. Stay level-headed, keep this thing together, and maybe things work out. But then that late in the game with that interception feels like one of those situations where DK may have started to give up on the game. I'm not saying that he did, but maybe he was. And then Geno, he lacks a signature win, right? Like, that's one of the biggest things that is criticized about him, is that he lacks a signature win. And a win over the 49ers would go a very, very long way to cement that status for Geno, that he wants to be paid like a top 10 quarterback. And we still don't have that. He's 0-4 versus the 49ers since he became Seattle's starter. So I think you've just got to get a better performance out of him. You got to get a better performance out of DK. When you have your stars not playing well against the 49ers, nobody's going to be happy.
Yeah, and Metcalf only caught 3 out of 11 targets in this game. And some of that you can just say that the game plan wasn't working, but Charvarius Ward was out. Like, you wanted to attack the 49ers secondary without their best corner. And the Seahawks, they could have had a 52-yard touchdown late in the game to Metcalf, but it was called back by an illegal formation. So the game just didn't pan out well for Geno Smith or DK Metcalf. On the defensive side of the football, listen, I'm just looking at a couple of the big runs in this game, and I did not get a chance to see the end zone film of the last 76-yard run, but the first 37-yard run by Jordan Mason, Tyrell Dodson got swallowed up by a block at the second level, and he could not get off the block. It created a massive seam, and we have seen this time and time again. There were a couple other plays in this game where he got hung up on blocks. That is causing major problems for the Seahawks run defense. Now, I'm not going to blame all that on him. The Seahawks got to find ways to help him out. But at the same time, as a linebacker, especially in this system, you got to be able to work off blocks. And there's just too many times right now where offensive linemen are successfully getting to him, and he is not able to get off of those blocks. There were a few times he got beat behind him in coverage in this game too. They got to have better performance out of number 0 to have a chance to be able to beat teams like the 49ers that have a lot of offensive weapons.
Yeah, I don't have a ton to say on Dodson at this point, Corbin, but where it stands is exactly what we were just talking about with you have either the short or the long runs. You're not getting those medium yardage runs. And that's because the linebackers are just not present in the run game. And I think that just has to be shored up. And I think you see, I know that you posted a couple clips and the film shows it, even from last week, Corbin, where you just have Dodson getting eaten up by some of these blocks. Once those offensive linemen get off their initial blocks and get to the second level, Dodson is consistently failing in that regard. And I think that he played pretty well the first couple weeks. Like, I was impressed by Tyrel Dodson over the first, especially during the 3-game win streak to start the season. But something just hasn't been right these past few weeks. And I think that just kind of explains the defense's entire struggles here these last 3 games. So I'm hoping they can figure it out quickly. Luckily, they have a mini bye. But the 3 games in 11 days, it's so hard to make those adjustments fast.
Yeah. And look, you don't want to make excuses, but that is an issue. Nonetheless, look, the 49ers had the short rest too. They've got injuries. It didn't matter. They were able to go out and they were able to execute. They didn't turn over the ball. They didn't give up those explosive run plays. Didn't give up very many explosive pass plays. Those are things that good teams don't allow to happen. And right now, the Seahawks, they're just not playing as a good football team right now in any phase. No. Offense, defense, special teams, too many mistakes, poor execution in all 3 phases. And that's why you find yourself in a position now, hey, it's the start of a new season. You're back at 500. You're 3-3. Can you get this ship righted now with this mini bye? That is going to be the question mark here now for the Seahawks as they prepare for week 7 against the Atlanta Falcons and get a few extra days to do so and hopefully get healthier for that game as well. As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Connor at Benintendi. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up tomorrow, it's a different Blue Friday than normal. We'll have some quarter awards. I know there's not really a quarter anymore in the season with 17 games, but we'll have our quarterly awards. And Friday flashback, we'll be looking at this game from a perspective of all 22 film. Make sure that you are listening in and enjoy the rest of your Thursday night. Go Hawks.